The snow outside the safe house took its time deciding whether to stay. It settled on the black iron of a Chicago rail spur like ash on a cooling stove, then slipped into the air again when a switching locomotive shouldered past and made the winter remember its duty. A man in an overcoat watched from a second-story window with a notebook held under his right sleeve. He wrote with his left hand because a Berlin case officer had once told him that anyone who wrote with his right hand in a city built for right-handed men would be remembered. He did not want to be remembered. He wanted to count. Freight cars moved like paragraphs on a page. Each had a number. Each number would be mailed in fragments to a box that had no name. He had no illusions about changing the war by counting freight cars. He was a spy. Counting was how spies prayed. In mid-March 1943, the prayer became a confession. Papers that had survived oceans and boredom were collated in Berlin into what the traffic clerk stamped as received. March 17th. An intelligence synthesis, the sort of document that usually made a tidy show of ignorance and a brave show of confidence, did something rare. It admitted the numbers had hardened into a shape that strategy could not break. The United States, whose clumsy overkill had been a joke in dinners where the table had held a cloth and the wine had not tasted like gasoline, had converted excess into a science. Ford's Willow Run, once a scandal of delays, was driving toward a B-24 every hour and change. Shipyards that had played like improv troupes learned choreography. 3 Liberty hulls every 2 days across the system on an average that could be defended with receipts. Aircraft output accelerated like a factory whistle that had learned the day had 26 hours, tens of thousands in 1943, more yet in 1944, harsh and democratic evidence that quantity had become a weapon. The synthesis did not shout. It brushed the page with understatement and made careers tremble. Long before the stamp touched the paper, the agents had seen what the numbers meant, for themselves, if not for headquarters. In Detroit, the man with the left hand watched Willow Run fix its personality. In 1942, it had stuttered. Skilled men were short. Suppliers missed trains. Managers learned that building bombers is not only building wings. A bomber is a system, and a system needs subsystems that never forgive improvisation. By spring 1943, the subsystems had stopped blushing. Rail spurs fed an assembly line that took aluminum and returned shadows on a runway. Women in kerchiefs, men with lunch pails, a million hands measuring off rivets by the yard. The agent counted bays, watched the takt time steady, and wrote a cryptic sentence that no one in his hotel would read. Their boredom is our enemy. He wrote that because boredom is the sound a system makes when it is healthy. The whine of drilling rigs was a catechism. The runway lit up at shift change, as if the war were a second moon. The Navy yards along the coasts spoke in a different vernacular, but kept the same grammar. Prefabricated sections arrived by rail, like such large toys that even humor had to respect them. Block by block, a hull grew, as if a child had thought it, and a city had executed it. Men who had never seen an ocean before the war stood in overalls that smelled like grease and salt, and listened to a foreman who had once worked a lathe tell them how to fit plate 3C to frame 21. A whistle blew. Cranes choreographed. Welders stitched light into seams and left their initials on lines no one would ever see again. Agents in Peabody hats and stiff collars discovered how to blend with the men by buying coffee and not returning the cup until the whistle blew again. The phrase 3 hulls every 2 days is a museum label. In the yards, it looked like daylight built into a habit. A ship slid into water, then another, so that even the spectators forgot to clap because the ceremony began to feel like clocks do. Inevitable. That inevitability is what the German synthesis remembered and could not forgive. Fuel depots made the spies nervous in a way shipyards did not. Yards carry an air of celebration. The launch, the crowd, the idea of a thing that will carry men to another horizon. Fuel depots are quiet and loud at once. Pipes knock, pumps hum, gauges lie if you let them. The agent in Baton Rouge stood on a levee behind reeds and watched tank farm lids breathe under a winter sun, each one a diaphragm of war. The smell made him sneeze into his sleeve and remember a time in Hamburg when hydrogen had made his lungs feel like fireworks. He thought of submarines. He thought of the telegrams from BDU celebrating a convoy ambush in a flourish of radio brevity. He had a little faith left in those triumphs. Then he watched a barge tie up and unload for 36 hours into tanks already fat with earlier barges, and realized faith is a choice men make when they are not allowed to count. He could count. He wrote a number and underlined it twice. He knew what a single submarine torpedo could do to a tanker. He also knew how quickly hoses could erase a torpedo from memory. Berlin was not prepared to be converted by a single report. Intelligence services are churches of skepticism, even when they are run by men who believe in nothing but their own eyes. The Abwehr liked craft, stories, the charm of a human source. The SD liked fear, paperwork, the power of seeing a man fold under attention. Both liked to be right more than they liked to be useful. The March 17th synthesis was inconvenient because it asked them to admit usefulness required surrendered pride. The clerks retrieved captured statistical digests and tables of output the Americans had been foolish enough to publish, or clever enough to publish, because who could stop them? They compared agent reports to those tables and found the agents less poetic and more accurate than the digests. The SD men muttered that Americans had no sense of security. The Abwehr men smiled and said Americans had a sense of security that came from having a factory on every horizon. Between them, the numbers sharpened themselves like knives. The phrase overkill had been a term of art for a certain kind of German analyst who liked to make fun of American material culture. Americans sent 2 trucks to do the work of 1, 5 ships to ensure the arrival of 3. Americans put a spare crane on a dock because a dock without a crane is a long sermon without a point. To the German taste, informed by an economy of scarcity and a moral vocabulary that made thrift feel like virtue, this looked like waste. The March 17th synthesis made clear that the moral vocabulary did not translate. A B-24 every 63 minutes, not in March 1943, but as an arrow pointing at spring 1944, was not waste. It was a lesson. Redundancy is the tax you pay for inevitability. The Liberty ship glide paths, the aircraft charts that looked like the profile of a mountain range, the depots where gasoline appeared in days that had only 24 hours. These argued with the word overkill and replaced it with a new word the clerks joked about. Enough. Enough is a quantity that breaks doctrine. German espionage did not operate in a vacuum. It lived in an atmosphere of fear, rivalry, and the thin air of an economy that needed the spies to be right to justify its own approach to war. Some reports were massaged to fit dogma because dogma is a jealous lover. Some were ignored because attention had been spent on the East, where blood wrote bigger poetry. Yet the men who counted in Chicago and Detroit and Baltimore and Baton Rouge and along the Willamette did not stop counting because a party secretary preferred adjectives. They mailed numbers. They designed covers for their numbers. A letter about a cousin's wedding that mentioned a station that did not exist. A postcard from Indiana that seemed to name a street, but was a code for a total tonnage out of a quarter's refinery throughput. The handlers, when they behaved, collated, and when they did not behave, the clerks collated anyway. On March 17th, the collation became something more. Recognition. Recognition is a change of tense. Until then, observation had allowed analysts to talk in future perfects. The Americans will have built. By this time next year, they will be able to. The synthesis abolished the future perfect and lodged itself in the simple present. They are building, they are launching, they are training. The manpower pipeline attached to the production pipeline with a grace that hurt to read. Service schools produced pilots in classes that arrived at squadrons synchronized with the deliveries of airplanes. Deck crews trained on wooden mock-ups that taught their hands to remember metal. Gunnery schools taught men to solve problems with angles and short bursts rather than long curses. A German agent in the Southwest photographed a march of air crew with a camera that pretended to be a cigarette case and wrote on the back of the picture a sentence more damning than any propaganda. They are building men to match the machines. What the synthesis did for Berlin, it did more quietly for the spies themselves. Men who had believed in the war as a story, aces, charges, the arithmetic of daring, reoriented to the war as a system. The man in Chicago stopped trying to summarize a yard in a paragraph and instead submitted a table of shift rotations, because shift rotations are how factories talk about tempo. The man in Detroit broke down a morning into tact counts and used the American word because it had become his. A handler in Madrid, who had spent 2 years being cynical about American know-how, smirking about jukeboxes and refrigerators, stopped smirking and started copying numbers carefully because numbers live longer than smirks. None of them loved the enemy for being industrious. They respected the enemy for selecting an axis of effort that did not allow romance to earn interest. Elsewhere in Berlin, men who read ships as if they were poems worried the numbers like a rosary. The U-boat arm had tasted late winter triumphs so delicious that they seemed doctrinal. Convoys burned. Captains sent short, proud signals. The line on the chart that marked the war against shipping looked briefly like a stairway down. Then the March 17 synthesis walked its fingers along yard outputs and canceled the stairway with a shrug. 3 hulls every 2 days across the Liberty system on average. On a chart that cannot imagine grief, the difference between 3 and 2 is an ocean. An officer who had spent a decade memorizing the psychology of sailors and the moods of weather sat with a ruler and a blue pencil and traced a line he could no longer misname. Even if the U-boats doubled their success, he wrote privately, the Americans would replace losses faster than morale could absorb the triumphs. That is a sentence intelligence officers avoid writing until they must. The desert reported its own footnotes to the synthesis. German staff in North Africa wrote in August and September 1942 about fuel like lovers write about absence. Tobruk's fall had delivered a week of fantasy. Thereafter the map lengthened into sand, and trucks burned gasoline to deliver gasoline in a demonstration that physics owns all empires. The March 17th report did not reference the desert directly. It did not need to. Allied fuel depots and pipelines were not a concept in North Africa. They were a diagnosis. If men can keep a truck fed across a continent because a refinery made a promise to a railhead, then the desert loses its favorite ally: distance. The report made an indirect and punitive promise. The Allied way of war would not allow geography to keep its usual secrets. Inside the paper, names appeared with the courtesy of formality: Willow Run, Portland, Richmond, Baltimore, Mobile, Pascagoula, Portland again, the other one, and San Pedro. Some of those names wore their vowels like neighborhoods. Others spoke like numbers. They had in common a discipline that scales. A German file summarized the Willow Run trend line as if it were a patient's pulse. 20 planes per day within sight, 30 within reach, 40 in the dreams of men who loved line graphs. Another file treated Liberty Yards like a league table, each yard arguing with the others in the polite language of rivets and welds and man-hours. Spies whispered among themselves, a loose network of professionals who admired craft more than citizenship, about the way U.S. management had turned quotas into parades. They put a cake on the floor when 1,000 engines have passed, one wrote, amused and taut, and then they go back to the line. It is difficult to defeat people who celebrate boredom with cake. The analysis included a paragraph about training that agents found irritating because it was correct. American training was derided in German circles as mechanical. The trainees could shoot, they could not think. They followed the book. They could not improvise. The March 17th document argued, without bravado, that the book included improvisation as a chapter rather than a rumor. Gunnery schools taught deflection not by drawing triangles, but by putting boys behind guns until their eyes found the solution that repeat makes obvious. Engine schools taught failure not with lectures, but with engines that were allowed to fail in classrooms where failure had consequences that looked like paperwork instead of funerals. Flight schools learned to fly in marginal weather because the war did not obey forecasts, and navigation schools learned how to believe a star and a watch while radios lied. The production pipeline had an opinion about training and expressed it every 15 minutes when a subassembly crossed a painted line on a floor in Michigan. Two things the agents noticed that the synthesis did not emphasize, but should have, were rail and electricity. Rail is the blood. Someone had to move coal to the boilers that made the electricity that made the motors turn, that made the tools spin, that made the planes and the ships and the depots. Agents in the Midwest took photographs of coal drifts taller than city blocks, feeding power stations whose names no one in Berlin recognized and whose capacities everyone in Berlin felt when they read the numbers. Electricity is the appetite. America had it like a man at a harvest. The agents who wrote about kilowatt hours learned to do so quietly, because the men who edited the reports grew nervous when they realized they were reading the language of a civilization and not a campaign. The spies had become archaeologists dazzled by a living city. Their shovels were pens. The day the synthesis arrived, an SD officer who prided himself on contempt tossed it on a colleague's desk and pronounced it statistics, not war. The colleague, a man who had once read engineering at the Technische Hochschule and still loved the exactness of materials, picked it up again after the contempt left the room. He turned pages and saw the footnotes that a clerk had dared to include because the numbers deserved parents. He traced a finger under the line about Willow Run's trajectory and wrote in the margin a moral that would never be printed. They will win by rehearsing. He did not mean practice alone. He meant the habit of making a system run without drama again and again until drama itself became a defect. He lit a cigarette and then, in an act of rare domesticity, emptied the ashtray and washed it in a basin because the idea of ash next to numbers displeased him suddenly. The agents in the field drew their own conclusions. One in Baltimore stopped trying to recruit a foreman at Sparrow's Point because the foreman had no time for romance. Output was his lover, and he was happy. Instead, the agent rented a room with a view of the yard and learned to identify plate sizes with binoculars. He discovered by accident that the yard had quietly shifted to a new sub-assembly approach. More trucks turning, fewer crane bottlenecks, and he added a line to his next report. They innovate by schedule and not by argument. Another agent in San Pedro watched a tanker slip from a fitting-out berth and wrote scornfully about society ladies who came to break champagne, and then wrote enviously about the work that resumed the moment the glass hit water. "Ceremony is a distraction that makes them faster," he wrote, and his handler laughed until he realized it was true. From time to time, the spies allowed themselves to feel useful. A report recommended an attack on a transformer farm that fed 2 shipyards and a refinery. A courier carried the recommendation across ocean and bureaucracy to men who signed papers that sent men in airplanes to drop bombs on coordinates. The bombs fell, the photographs came back, the agents read the captions. The line about temporary interruption, repairs in 72 hours, made the usefulness smaller again. America had invented standard spares for electricity. The spies began to hate standardization the way artists hate cliches. They did not realize that cliché is a word artists use for habits that pay rent. The March 17 synthesis included a sentence that would be repeated to comfort and to threaten for the next 2 years among those who bothered to read. The Allied tempo is now set by logistics. It is a sentence that sounds boring and aims to be terrifying. Tempo is not just speed, it is the control of speed. A man who decides when he is fast has already deprived his enemy of a calendar. In mid-1943, the German war effort still made choices that looked ambitious. The spring in the Atlantic taught U-boats to be arrogant. The Blue Desert taught Rommel to be clever. Fighters from German skies taught bomber streams to respect flak. The March report did not call any of that hopeless. It called it insufficient. Insufficient is a quiet guillotine. It drops very slowly, and then all at once. A week after the stamp, an analyst in Berlin with an affection for clean notebooks wrote a memorandum to a friend in the armaments ministry. It was an exercise in trying to be honest without being fired. "We can deny the scale for a quarter," he wrote, "and we can bleed it for another quarter. We cannot prevent its arrival. We must therefore play for time as if time were a material." Time is a material when you have factories to feed and men to train. The Americans had learned to buy it in block lots. The Germans had learned to borrow it at bad interest. The memorandum did not go far. It circulated among men who liked to scratch their initials in margins as if a signature could scold a line graph into humility. For frontline commanders, the synthesis was background music. They learned its melody by echo. On bad days, supplies did not arrive. On good days, they arrived and were still not enough. Commanders wrote to Berlin asking for excuses to be converted into trains. Berlin wrote back with pep and casualty figures. The men at the front began to understand that liturgy is not a plan. They did not need to read the March 17th synthesis to recognize a system when it pressed against their maps like a tide. In Russia, the winter brought an industrial country to bear on a geography that had never been impressed by conquerors. In North Africa, the spring carried pipes and rails and doctors and mechanics to the edge of a minefield named Alamein and made it smaller. In the Atlantic, escort carriers and HFDF and long-range patrol squeezed the wolf pack until the pack needed fresh wolves, faster than schools could supply them. A spy's report cannot claim those victories. It can only count their ingredients while they are mixing. Toward the end of March, the Chicago agent with the left hand made a mistake. He wrote with his right hand because the cold had numbed his left. The man at the newsstand noticed. The agent bought a paper he did not want and walked 3 extra blocks and smoked a cigarette he did not enjoy, then returned to his room and burned his notes and started again. He switched to a typewriter, the enemy of secrets and the friend of precision. He typed about Willow Run's learning curve, about rail car turn times, about the coffee line at 4 in the morning and the lunch line at noon, about the way men spoke of their work without adjectives. He wrote that they were tired in the way well-fed men are tired. He wrote that they were proud in the way trained men are proud. He mailed the letter in pieces. In Berlin, an editor stapled the pieces together and noted in the corner, March 17th, because something had shifted that needed to be memorialized by an accident of date. If there is a moral, it lives where spies hate to look, in statistics printed with a calm that insulted and then converted them. The synthesis on March 17th did not reveal a miracle. It recognized a machine that had had time to warm up and had begun, finally, to run. In 1941, the spies had watched the United States fidget. In 1942, they had watched it assemble. In early 1943, they watched it metabolize. An industrial civilization had taught itself to speak war fluently. The spies wrote it down. A clerk stamped a date. Men who had believed in overkill learned to define it as enough, repeated. On other fronts, men died. In offices, men counted. The connection was not sentimental. It was causal. The spies left the safe houses and rail yards and depots and hotel rooms and moved on to other addresses because that is what spies do. But the date stayed, the way a map remembers a river. March 17th, 1943, when observation became recognition, and recognition became the long sigh before a nation learns to measure its own ending. The origin story of the synthesis is not dramatic. An Abwehr colonel complained that his desk could not think because it could not breathe under the weight of paper. A new lieutenant with good handwriting suggested a Sammelbericht, a gleaning, a harvest of reports. The word carried a faint odor of farms, and the colonel approved because he came from a town where grain needed barns as much as fields. The lieutenant visited sections, borrowed clerks, and made enemies by asking for the boring pages. Not the story about seducing a secretary in a factory office, not the legend about a midnight ride past a military police post, but the tables, shifts, counts, cycling times, tonnages by quarter. He copied, he sorted, he developed a taste for seeing 12 different sources write the same number without knowing each other existed. It is a proof in the geometries of espionage. Congruence, superposition, the music of independent witnesses agreeing. One of the Chicago man's early notes had described a rail yard as a throat. Willow Run ate through that throat, he wrote, the way a smoker drinks coffee. By March 1943, he coined another phrase he liked better: capillaries. The war had capillaries. They ran to every loading dock, every sub-assembly plant, every cafeteria that somehow learned to feed 1,000 at 11:30 and 1,000 again at noon 10 without accusation. He discovered that a factory's cafeteria is a timepiece. If the line is wrong, the takt is wrong. He drew a childish map of steam lines, power conduits, compressed air manifolds, fuel mains, a vascular diagram that an engineer would correct, and an analyst would understand anyway. Berlin did not request the map. It arrived in a packet with a safe cover story and sat on a desk until a tired clerk turned it right side up and realized it described how a building thinks. From Detroit came a series of postcards addressed to no one that mentioned baseball. The cards spoke of the spring and the way men in caps leaned against fences. In each, the score included a number that was not a score. Add the 3 scores together, and you had the number of B-24 wing sets observed leaving a sub-assembly plant that week. It is a small part of a bomber, the wing set, unless you are counting. The postcards changed tone in March 1943. The score figures were candid now, too large to hide cleverly. The agent knew then that American counterintelligence did not mind a German seeing the numbers. It might even prefer it. Confidence is a kind of mask that persuades the enemy to save his masks for other parties. A German agent at the Richmond yard wrote prose that editors disliked, too literary for the Abwehr, which liked its sentences square. He described a launch as a city learning to pull its own shadow into water. He described sparks as language. He described the way a hull moving off the ways made men hold their breath as a civilian drill. His handler scolded him and underlined the quantifiable lines: launch rate, berths, cranes, shifts. Yet when the March 17th synthesis gave the yards their due, the poetry showed through the numbers. There is a rhythm to 3 hulls every 2 days that any drummer hears. The Spies' lyrical impatience had been a form of precision unrecognized by coarser editors. In Baltimore, steel plate was the alphabet, and letters arrived by barge and rail to be sorted into words named for ships. The agent there counted plate lengths and learned to translate them into tonnage. He sent the translation key with his report as a courtesy to a Berlin desk that did not own the time to relearn every yard's dialect. On March 17th, that courtesy became a habit across the network. Agents began to include dictionaries in their packets. It was a sign that they had ceased to believe in a single report that would save the Reich, and had started to believe in a cumulative fairness that would at least tell the truth about failure. Some spies tried sabotage with their numbers. In Los Angeles, a man placed a magnet in a telephone exchange with a prayer for an outage. It worked for an hour, a small insult to a timetable. He returned to counting because counting left fewer fingerprints. The March synthesis mentions no sabotage, not because none occurred, but because the editors had learned the difference between anecdotes that taste like victory and statistics that smell like it. Worldwide, saboteurs felt cheated by statisticians. They were not wrong to feel it. They were wrong to insist on it. The Liberty ship numbers often dance in memory with the myth of the 4-day ship. The spies were careful to unromanticize the legend in their memos. The Essex hull built in a handful of days was a stunt rooted in pre-built sections and a mountain of preparation. The usual pace was slower but relentless. The agents understood that relentlessness would drown them more surely than spectacle. On March 17th, the average, always the enemy of myth, took the field. 3 hulls every 2 days entered gossip as a truth militantly without adjectives. The agents repeated it as if repetition could stun them into acceptance. Training pipelines, an ugly metaphor to men who had adored fighter aces and tank wizards, received a fresh cruelty that spring. The spies had to admit they were seeing a nation learn scale without losing craft. In Florida, a gunnery officer had his class shoot clay pigeons until their wrists ached, then mounted them behind Brownings and had them shoot skeet again out of a fuselage mock-up. "You will not think," he told a boy from Kansas. "You will count." In Texas, an instrument instructor blindfolded a pilot and had him touch each gauge face in order until he can do it with one glove and then the other. Boredom again, the enemy and lover of saboteurs, was the ally of production. March 17th's authors did not write these vignettes. Their footnotes did the work. Class sizes per week, accident rates per 1,000 hours, pass-fail ratios trending downward in failure and upward in pass. Humans hidden in fractions. For the men who wrote submarine reports, March 17th preceded a domestic crisis. Many of them had wives who believed in their glory and children who believed in white caps and silver badges. The memo said, without malice, that a wolf pack is a bad instrument against flotillas that include factories in their wake. The escorts that now accompanied convoys looked like shipyards had followed the ships to sea. Air cover arrived from odd corners, little carriers sewn together from freighters, long-range aircraft that had once failed and now arrived as if a mile had learned to be twice as long. The spies understood that one cannot torpedo a trend line. They understood it, and then they returned to recommending ambushes because some duties do not yield to epiphanies. Willow Run's approach to scale produced an art argument the spies did not expect to have with themselves. One of them, a man who had read Rilke and designed a chair once before the war spoiled his hands, stood at a mezzanine and watched a fuselage roll past beneath a forest of torque wrenches and drills. He felt grief and awe. "This is what cathedrals used to do," he wrote in a note to a woman he had loved in Prague and might not see again. "They remind the living of how many hands it takes to go to heaven." The handler had the note copied before burning. March 17th summary said, "Line speed increasing." Both documents told the truth. Only one would be quoted at briefings. Abwehr and SD rivalry made the synthesis harder and better. The SD sent anecdotes with venom in the punctuation. The Abwehr sent numbers with condescension in the footnotes. The synthesis editor, whose name does not survive but whose temperament does, removed the venom and the condescension and let the numbers and anecdotes coexist. On March 17th, he wrote a line that was half apology and half triumph. "We have enough from both to claim certainty. Intelligence hates certainty because certainty makes it disposable." That, perhaps, is why the date became legend among a small fraternity. They admired the act of making themselves less necessary. An agent in the Great Lakes region recorded the movement of oil by barge with the disgust of a man who had been forced to learn another profession. He preferred politics to pipelines, seduction to schedules. Yet his prose sharpened as he learned. "They have taught the river to be a pipe," he wrote. "It delivers like a letter." He captured in that sentence what many of his colleagues felt, that Americans had subdued topography not with brilliance, but with attrition. Europe bred knife fighters in strategy. America produced carpenters. You cannot outduel a house. Discussion in Berlin in late March and early April turned to what to do. The answer was what it had been all along: attack the factories, sink the ships, gesture toward terror where terror's arithmetic could not help. But the discussions grew more respectful of the thing they were trying to break. A bomber that took 12 hours to assemble in propaganda took 1,200 hours in the world. Men began to say "ours" with reverence instead of impatience. Some laughed at themselves for the change. Others smoked and signed and sent men to their work anyway. March 17th sat in their files like a bell that had been rung. They could not unhear it. The spies themselves felt a peculiar relief. To act in the world without pretending you can change it is a freedom historians rarely grant to villains. They went on counting, and some died, and some went to prison, and some vanished into the to-do lists of men who mislaid names as easily as pencils. March 17th did not save them. It made their last months belong to the truth. There are worse fates than that. If a single date can stand for a change in perception, March 17th, 1943 did so for a cadre of German spies who had been trained to despise American excess and were forced, in the end, to define it as discipline. The files remain: shift counts, yard rates, depots that breathed in and out like animals. The world they described is gone, but the grammar survives. Tempo set by logistics, men trained to the pace of machines, machines built to the scale of a continent. When the stamp hit the paper, the room did not go silent. It went efficient. That is how wars end, not when the last shot is fired, but when the first count is believed. If a single date can stand for a change in perception, March 17th, 1943 did so for a cadre of German spies who had been trained to despise American excess and were forced in the end to define it as discipline. The files remain: shift counts, yard rates, depots that breathed in and out like animals. The world they described is gone, but the grammar survives. Tempo set by logistics, men trained to the pace of machines, machines built to the scale of a continent. When the stamp hit the paper, the room did not go silent. It went efficient. That is how wars end. Not when the last shot is fired, but when the first count is believed. If a single date can stand for a change in perception, March 17th, 1943 did so for a cadre of German spies who had been trained to despise American excess and were forced in the end to define it as discipline. The files remain: shift counts, yard rates, depots that breathed in and out like animals. The world they described is gone, but the grammar survives. Tempo set by logistics, men trained to the pace of machines, machines built to the scale of a continent. When the stamp hit the paper, the room did not go silent. It went efficient. That is how wars end, not when the last shot is fired, but when the first count is believed. If a single date can stand for a change in perception, March 17th, 1943 did so for a cadre of German spies who had been trained to despise American excess and were forced, in the end, to define it as discipline. The files remain: shift counts, yard rates, depots that breathed in and out like animals. The world they described is gone, but the grammar survives. Tempo set by logistics, men trained to the pace of machines, machines built to the scale of a continent. When the stamp hit the paper, the room did not go silent. It went efficient. That is how wars end, not when the last shot is fired, but when the first count is believed. If a single date can stand for a change in perception, March 17, 1943 did so for a cadre of German spies who had been trained to despise American excess and were forced, in the end, to define it as discipline. The files remain: shift counts, yard rates, depots that breathed in and out like animals. The world they described is gone, but the grammar survives. Tempo set by logistics, men trained to the pace of machines, machines built to the scale of a continent. When the stamp hit the paper, the room did not go silent. It went efficient. That is how wars end, not when the last shot is fired, but when the first count is believed. If a single date can stand for a change in perception, March 17, 1943 did so for a cadre of German spies who had been trained to despise American excess and were forced, in the end, to define it as discipline. The files remain: shift counts, yard rates, depots that breathed in and out like animals. The world they described is gone, but the grammar survives. Tempo set by logistics, men trained to the pace of machines, machines built to the scale of a continent. When the stamp hit the paper, the room did not go silent. It went efficient. That is how wars end, not when the last shot is fired, but when the first count is believed.